"Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." Immediately. The officer's hand moved to her holster as Diane Thompson knelt beside her stalled sedan on the quiet street in Alexandria, Virginia. The 52-year-old automotive engineer had no idea that the passenger, still hidden behind tinted windows, waiting patiently in the back seat, was about to change everything. What happened next would expose a truth about assumptions and dignity that even the most powerful office in America couldn't ignore. The Wednesday morning had started with the kind of promise that made Diane Thompson grateful for every decision that had led her to this moment. At 5:45 a.m., she'd carefully pressed her work clothes, a professional navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, paired with dark slacks that carried the faint scent of lavender from her cedar closet. Her low heels sat by the door, polished to a subtle shine that spoke of careful maintenance rather than luxury. Her reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman shaped by decades of persistence in spaces that hadn't always welcomed her. Warm brown skin that carried laugh lines around her eyes. Natural hair pulled back into a neat bun. Reading glasses hanging from a delicate chain around her neck. Hands that bore the subtle scars of years working with engines, transmissions, and diagnostic equipment that most people only saw under the hoods of their cars. At 52, Diane Thompson had built something remarkable from almost nothing. Her automotive engineering firm, Thompson Precision Solutions, operated out of a modest facility in Springfield, Virginia, specializing in solving mechanical problems that stumped everyone else. She'd started 28 years ago with a used toolbox, a community college degree, and a determination that her gender and race wouldn't define her capabilities. The certifications on her office wall told a story of relentless excellence: Master ASE certification, specialized training in hybrid systems, advanced diagnostics for luxury European vehicles, and expertise in retrofitting classic cars with modern safety systems. Major dealerships across the DMV area called her when their own mechanics hit dead ends. Insurance companies referred clients to her for second opinions. She'd testified as an expert witness in product liability cases. But today wasn't about her business. Today was extraordinary. The phone call had arrived 5 days earlier from a Washington number she didn't recognize. The woman's voice was professional, measured, careful. "Ms. Thompson? My name is Jennifer Caldwell from the Presidential Transportation Division. I'm calling regarding a matter that requires both discretion and exceptional technical expertise." Diane had assumed it was an elaborate scam. She received calls weekly from people claiming to be government officials, usually trying to sell extended warranties or steal her identity. "Ma'am, I appreciate the call, but I don't respond to unsolicited. I understand your skepticism. Please check your email in the next 60 seconds. You'll receive a message from an official whitehouse.gov address with verification codes you can confirm through the Secret Service's Public Liaison Office." The email arrived 47 seconds later. Diane's hands trembled as she read the authentication details, the security clearance requirements, and the nature of the request that seemed impossible to believe. The president's personal vehicle, not the famous armored limousine seen in motorcades, but a more discreet sedan used for less formal travel, had developed an intermittent mechanical issue that no one could diagnose. The problem occurred randomly, always at low speeds, always in secure areas where breakdowns created logistical nightmares for security teams. 3 different mechanics had examined the vehicle. 2 dealership service departments had run full diagnostics. An engineering team from the manufacturer had replaced dozens of components. The problem persisted. Someone in the Secret Service had remembered Diane's testimony in a federal case 3 years earlier, where she'd identified a microscopic manufacturing defect that explained why certain luxury sedans stalled unpredictably. Her analysis had led to a major recall and saved lives. "We need someone who sees what others miss," Jennifer Caldwell had explained. "Your reputation suggests you're that person." The background check process took 3 days. Diane provided documentation going back to her childhood in Durham, North Carolina. References from high school teachers, college professors, business clients, and even neighbors. Financial records. Travel history. Every detail of her life examined by professionals trained to find reasons for concern. She told her wife, Patricia, Only the bare minimum. I have a specialized government contract. It's confidential. I'll be home by dinner. Patricia had studied her face across their kitchen table that morning, reading decades of shared history in Diane's expression. You're nervous. I'm terrified, Diane admitted. What if I can't fix it? What if I'm not as good as they think I am? Patricia had taken her hand. Baby, you've been proving people wrong about what you can do since you were 16 years old, fixing cars in your daddy's garage. This is just one more engine. You'll figure it out. Now, at 7:30 a.m., Diane drove her own vehicle, a lovingly maintained 1994 Lexus LS 400 that she'd rebuilt from the ground up, through the early morning traffic toward a private government facility in Alexandria. The address she'd been given didn't appear on any public maps. Her GPS refused to recognize it. The instructions were explicit: enter through the unmarked entrance on Fairfax Avenue. Show credentials at 3 separate checkpoints. Maintain complete silence about the assignment. Tell absolutely no one. Her toolbox sat in the passenger seat, a custom-built aluminum case containing instruments she'd collected over nearly 3 decades. Each tool represented a problem solved, a customer helped, a reputation built one careful repair at a time. The diagnostic scanner alone had cost more than her first car. The facility's security made airport screenings look casual by comparison. Armed guards examined her credentials with intensity that made her mouth go dry. Biometric scanners recorded her fingerprints, retinal patterns, and facial geometry. A German shepherd sniffed her toolbox with professional thoroughness while his handler watched her reactions. Miss Thompson? A man in a dark suit with an obvious earpiece approached as she cleared the final checkpoint. I'm Agent Marcus Hall, Secret Service. Thank you for your punctuality. Agent Hall, I have to be honest, I'm still processing that this is actually happening. His expression softened slightly. I understand. The vehicle you'll be examining is significant. But we've done our research. Your track record speaks for itself. He led her through a climate-controlled garage that housed vehicles representing hundreds of millions in taxpayer investment. Armored SUVs, communications trucks, backup limousines, and specialized emergency response vehicles. But they stopped at what appeared to be an ordinary black sedan, a Lincoln Continental that could blend into any executive parking lot. This is Phoenix, Agent Hall explained, using what was clearly a code name. One of several vehicles in the secure transport fleet. The intermittent stalling issue has occurred 6 times in the past 2 months. Always at speeds below 15 miles per hour. Always in secure areas. Never in public, which suggests environmental factors we can't identify. Diane knelt beside the vehicle, her trained eye already scanning for anomalies that others might dismiss. The tires showed unusual wear patterns. The suspension sat slightly lower on the driver's side. Small details that created a diagnostic picture. Has anyone checked the mass airflow sensor correlation with the throttle position during low-speed urban driving scenarios? Agent Hall consulted a tablet. I'm not seeing that specific test in the service records. That's because most mechanics wouldn't think to look there. May I begin? One moment. Agent Hall's expression shifted to something more serious. I need to inform you of an unusual circumstance regarding today's diagnostic work. Diane stood, sensing something significant in his tone. The president is currently in the vehicle. The toolbox nearly slipped from Diane's grip. I'm sorry, what did you just say? There's a secure video conference happening inside the passenger compartment. National security matter that required the specific communications infrastructure this vehicle provides. The president is aware of your presence and has personally authorized this maintenance work to proceed. Diane's legs felt unsteady. Agent Hall, I fix cars. I don't work around. I mean, I've never. This is completely outside my. Miss Thompson. His voice was firm but kind. You were selected because you're the best at what you do. The president understands that excellence doesn't always come from expected places. Can you diagnose this problem while working around the exterior of the vehicle? Diane took a deep breath, finding the professional composure that had carried her through countless challenging situations. Yes, sir. I can do that. The conference should conclude in approximately 2 hours. Stay visible to security cameras. Don't approach the passenger compartment. If testing requires accessing the interior, clear it with me first. Understood completely. Agent Hall handed her a security badge with her photo and clearance level. Good luck, Ms. Thompson. Diane began her examination with the methodical precision that had made her reputation. She started with the obvious diagnostic points: fuel pressure regulators, oxygen sensors, electronic throttle control. But her instincts, honed over 28 years of solving impossible problems, told her this issue lived somewhere more subtle. She connected her diagnostic scanner to the vehicle's computer, watching data streams that would mean nothing to most people but told her a story about how this machine thought, breathed, and responded to its environment. 63 minutes into her analysis, lying on a rolling creeper beneath the chassis examining ground wire connections, she heard voices approaching. Not the quiet, professional tones of Secret Service agents. These voices carried authority of a different kind, sharper, more aggressive. Ma'am, you need to step away from that vehicle right now. Diane rolled out from under the sedan to find 2 police officers standing over her. Their uniforms identified them as Alexandria Police Department. Both had their hands near their service weapons, and their expressions showed nothing but suspicion. Officers, I'm authorized to be here. I'm the automotive engineer called in to. We didn't ask for your credentials, the female officer interrupted. Her nameplate read L. Morrison. We received a report of suspicious activity. Someone tampering with government vehicles in a restricted area. Diane's heart began racing, but she kept her voice steady and professional. If you check with Secret Service agent Marcus Hall, he can verify my. Stand up slowly, the male officer commanded. His nameplate identified him as D. Peterson. Keep your hands visible at all times. Diane complied, her mind spinning with confusion. How had local police gained access to a secure federal facility? Why weren't the Secret Service agents who'd been monitoring her work intervening? Officer Morrison circled around Diane, her eyes scanning with obvious skepticism. What's your business here? I'm an automotive engineer. Thompson Precision Solutions. I was contracted to diagnose a mechanical issue with. Contracted? Peterson's laugh was harsh. To work on presidential vehicles? You expect us to believe that? It's the truth. I have security clearance. I passed extensive background checks. Agent Hall escorted me here personally. Morrison picked up Diane's toolbox without asking permission, opening it and examining the expensive diagnostic equipment inside with rough handling that made Diane wince. Officers, please be careful with that equipment. Some of those instruments are very sensitive. Don't tell us how to do our jobs, Morrison snapped. You're in a restricted government facility with access to high-value assets. We have every right to investigate. The professional composure Diane had maintained through countless challenges began cracking. I'm not a threat. I'm a professional who was invited here to solve a problem. This is a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Peterson stepped closer, using his height advantage to intimidate. Or a cover story. How do we know you're not trying to plant something? Compromise vehicle security? The accusation hit Diane like a slap. 28 years of building a reputation through meticulous work and uncompromising integrity, reduced to accusations of sabotage and criminality. That's absurd. I've worked with federal agencies before. I've testified in court cases. My business has maintained security clearances for defense contractor work. You can verify everything. Everybody's got a story, Morrison said dismissively. We'll verify it downtown after you're processed. Turn around. Hands behind your back. You're arresting me? On what charges? Trespassing in a secure facility. Suspicious behavior near critical government assets. Possible tampering with federal property. Peterson's hand moved to his handcuffs. We can add resisting arrest if you don't cooperate. Diane felt her professional world collapsing. She'd been invited here. Cleared by the Secret Service. Trusted with one of the most sensitive mechanical problems imaginable. And now she was being treated like a criminal in front of the very vehicle she'd been authorized to repair. The vehicle where the president sat, 20 feet away, completely unaware of the humiliation unfolding outside. I want to speak to Agent Hall. Immediately. You'll speak when we tell you to speak, Morrison said, her voice hard. This isn't a negotiation. Diane's eyes swept the parking area, searching desperately for the Secret Service agents who'd been monitoring her work. Where were they? Why wasn't anyone intervening? Peterson moved closer, and Diane saw his hand rest on his service weapon with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with escalation. Everything inside her went cold. She thought about Patricia waiting at home, expecting her wife back by dinner with stories about an interesting government contract. She thought about her business, built brick by brick through excellence and persistence. She thought about every time she'd walked into a room full of men who assumed she couldn't possibly know what she was talking about, and proved them wrong through sheer competence. And she thought about the president, sitting in that car behind bulletproof glass, making decisions that affected millions of lives, completely unaware that outside, a black woman who'd been invited here to help was being treated like a threat simply for existing in a space where people like her weren't expected to be. Officer Morrison reached for Diane's arm, her grip firm and unyielding. Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent. The passenger door of the Lincoln Continental opened. The passenger door of the Lincoln Continental opened with a soft, authoritative click that seemed to freeze time itself. Officer Morrison's hand stopped mid-reach toward Diane's arm. Peterson's confident posture stiffened. Every person in the immediate vicinity, security personnel who had suddenly materialized from various positions, turned toward the vehicle with expressions ranging from shock to professional alertness. A woman in her late 50s stepped out first. Her dark suit, sensible heels, and the unmistakable Secret Service earpiece identified her as part of the protective detail. But it was her expression, a mixture of barely controlled fury and professional discipline, that made both police officers take an involuntary step backward. Officers, step away from Ms. Thompson immediately. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. I'm Senior Agent Victoria Chen, Special Agent in charge of this detail. You are interfering with authorized maintenance on a secure vehicle during an active protection operation. Peterson found his voice first, though it had lost its earlier confidence. Ma'am, we received a call about suspicious activity. You received no such call, Agent Chen interrupted coldly. This facility has a single point of contact for law enforcement coordination, and no alert was issued. How did you gain access to this secure location? Morrison's face had gone pale. The gate security said there was a situation. The gate security would never say that because they have no authority to make that determination. Agent Chen moved closer, her badge held up for both officers to see clearly. Who actually sent you here? The question hung in the air unanswered as a second figure emerged from the vehicle. President Elizabeth Hammond stepped out of the Lincoln Continental with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention without demanding it. At 61, she carried herself with the poise that came from 3 decades in public service, first as a state attorney general, then governor, and now in her second year as the nation's 47th president. She wasn't wearing the formal attire usually seen in press conferences. Instead, she had on a simple gray cardigan over a white blouse, reading glasses perched on her head, and an expression that radiated both warmth toward Diane and ice toward the 2 officers. Ms. Thompson, President Hammond said, her voice carrying easily across the parking area. I'm so sorry you've been subjected to this treatment. Diane couldn't speak. Her mouth opened, but no words emerged. The President of the United States was standing 15 feet away, addressing her directly, apologizing to her. President Hammond walked toward Diane with deliberate steps, ignoring the police officers entirely as if they'd ceased to exist. She stopped directly in front of Diane, and her expression softened with something that looked like personal understanding. I was on a video conference with the Joint Chiefs when I heard what was happening outside, the president said. I couldn't interrupt immediately without compromising the discussion, but Agent Chen was monitoring the situation and kept me informed. What these officers did to you is unacceptable. Madam President, Peterson stammered, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. We didn't know, we had no idea. President Hammond turned to face him, and the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. You didn't know what, Officer Peterson? That Miss Thompson was invited here? That she passed extensive background checks? That she's one of the most respected automotive engineers in the region? No, ma'am, I mean. Or did you mean you didn't know that your assumptions about who belongs in professional spaces would be witnessed by the President of the United States? Morrison tried to salvage the situation. Madam President, with all respect, we were just doing our jobs. We saw someone working on a vehicle in a secure area. You saw a black woman with tools and immediately assumed criminal activity, President Hammond said flatly. Let's be honest about what happened here. Ms. Thompson was professionally dressed, clearly had authorized access, was using expensive diagnostic equipment, and was working methodically on a vehicle in plain view of security cameras. Nothing about her behavior suggested suspicious activity. Agent Chen stepped forward with a tablet, her voice professionally neutral but her anger barely contained. Officers, I have security footage from 4 different angles showing Ms. Thompson's arrival, her credentials check, her escort by Agent Hall, and her authorized work on this vehicle. At no point did she do anything that warranted law enforcement intervention. Furthermore, Agent Chen continued, her voice getting harder, I have audio recording of your entire interaction. Your accusations of tampering, your threats of arrest, your refusal to verify her credentials through proper channels, and your aggressive posturing toward a civilian who was completely compliant and professional throughout. Peterson's face had turned red. Morrison looked like she might be sick. President Hammond turned back to Diane, and her expression transformed back to concern. Ms. Thompson, are you all right? Did either of these officers physically harm you? Diane found her voice, though it trembled. No, Madam President. They just scared me. And they handled my equipment roughly. The president's jaw tightened. She walked over to Diane's toolbox, which Morrison had set down when the president emerged. Opening it, she examined the sophisticated diagnostic equipment with obvious appreciation. My father was a mechanic, President Hammond said, her voice carrying memories. He owned a small shop in Pittsburgh. He taught me that tools like these represent years of investment, learning, and craftsmanship. They're not just objects. They're the instruments of someone's livelihood and professional identity. She closed the toolbox carefully and turned back to the officers. Agent Chen, I want a full investigation into how these officers gained unauthorized access to a secure facility and who provided them with false information about suspicious activity. Yes, Madam President. I also want their department brass contacted immediately. Their chief will hear directly from me about this incident. Understood, Madam President. Peterson tried one more time, his voice desperate. Madam President, if we had known Ms. Thompson was authorized. President Hammond cut him off with a raised hand. Officer Peterson, that's precisely the problem. You shouldn't have needed to know she was authorized. You should have verified her credentials through proper channels before making accusations. You should have treated her with the same professional courtesy you'd extend to anyone else in this situation. She paused, letting her words sink in. But more fundamentally, you should have looked at a professional woman with expensive equipment, working methodically in a secure area with camera coverage, and thought she probably belongs here rather than immediately assuming criminal activity. Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. We made a mistake. Yes, you did. A mistake rooted in assumptions that have no place in law enforcement. President Hammond's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent a lifetime confronting similar assumptions. Ms. Thompson has been subjected to humiliation, accusation, and the threat of arrest while trying to provide a service that was specifically requested by my office. Agent Hall appeared from a side entrance, slightly out of breath. Madam President, I apologize. I stepped away for less than 5 minutes to coordinate with Agent Hall. This isn't your fault, President Hammond assured him. This is a systemic failure that we're going to address comprehensively. She turned back to Diane, and her voice became gentle again. Miss Thompson, I'm going to make this right. But first, I need to ask you something. Can you still focus on diagnosing the vehicle issue after what you've just experienced? Diane took a deep breath, finding the professional core that had sustained her through decades of challenges. Yes, Madam President. I can. In fact, I believe I've already identified the problem. President Hammond's eyebrows rose. You have? Yes, ma'am. It's a correlation issue between the electronic throttle control and the mass airflow sensor during specific low-speed urban driving conditions. The sensors are sending conflicting data to the engine control module, causing the fail-safe protocols to engage intermittently. It's a software calibration problem, not a hardware failure. That's why replacing components didn't fix it. Agent Chen looked at her tablet, scrolling through technical reports. Miss Thompson, 3 different mechanics and an engineering team from the manufacturer spent weeks on this problem. They were looking at hardware, Diane explained, her confidence returning as she spoke about her expertise. This is a software interaction issue that only manifests under very specific conditions that happen frequently in secure facilities with controlled speed limits but rarely in normal driving. President Hammond smiled with genuine appreciation. How long to fix it? If I can access the vehicle's computer system directly, about 45 minutes to recalibrate the sensor correlation protocols. Then please, proceed with your work. President Hammond gestured toward the vehicle. And Agent Hall will stay with you throughout to ensure no further interruptions. As Diane gathered her equipment, President Hammond walked back to where the 2 police officers stood, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Officers Morrison and Peterson, you'll be escorted off this facility immediately. You'll provide full statements about how you gained access and who provided you with information. And you'll be hearing from both your department leadership and federal authorities about today's actions. Yes, Madam President, they said in unison, their voices hollow. As Secret Service agents moved to escort the officers away, President Hammond called out one more time. Officers? One more thing. They turned back, faces ashen. When you make assumptions about people based on how they look rather than what they're doing, you don't just harm them. You harm yourselves, your profession, and the principles this country is supposed to represent. I hope you'll remember Miss Thompson's grace under pressure the next time you're tempted to judge someone's right to be somewhere based on anything other than their actions and credentials. The officers were led away, and the parking area seemed to exhale collectively. President Hammond walked back to Diane one more time. Miss Thompson, when you're finished with the repair, I'd like to speak with you privately if you're willing. No pressure, I know you've had an ordeal. I'd be honored, Madam President. President Hammond smiled warmly and extended her hand. Diane shook it, feeling the surreal nature of the moment wash over her. The president's grip was firm, warm, genuine. Thank you for your professionalism today, Ms. Thompson. And thank you for reminding everyone here that excellence comes in many forms and from many places. As President Hammond returned to the vehicle to conclude her video conference, Agent Chen approached Diane with an apologetic expression. Miss Thompson, I should have been monitoring more closely. Those officers never should have gotten near you. Diane shook her head. Agent Chen, you can't prevent people from making assumptions. You can only respond when they act on them inappropriately. Which you did. Still, I'm sorry you experienced that. Diane picked up her diagnostic scanner and turned toward the Lincoln Continental. Agent Chen, I've experienced versions of that my entire career. The difference today is that for once, the most powerful person in the country was there to witness it and call it what it is. She paused, looking at the vehicle that had brought her to this extraordinary moment. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a car to fix. 42 minutes later, Diane Thompson closed the hood of the Lincoln Continental with the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved. Her diagnostic scanner showed clean data streams, the electronic throttle control and mass airflow sensor now communicating in perfect harmony. The intermittent stalling issue that had stumped multiple mechanics and engineering teams was resolved through careful calibration and understanding of how complex systems interact under specific conditions. Agent Hall had watched her work with fascination, asking occasional questions about her diagnostic process. His respect for her expertise was evident in how he listened, not with the skepticism she'd encountered from the police officers, but with genuine interest in learning from someone who understood their craft at the highest level. "That should do it," Diane said, wiping her hands on a clean shop cloth. "I'd recommend test driving under typical secure facility conditions to verify, but the sensor correlations are now properly calibrated." "Remarkable," Agent Hall said. "You solved in under an hour what's been a problem for months." "Sometimes fresh eyes see what familiarity misses," Diane replied, packing her tools with practiced efficiency. The previous mechanics weren't incompetent, they just approached it as a hardware problem because that's what their training and experience suggested. President Hammond emerged from the vehicle as Diane finished organizing her toolbox. The president had clearly concluded her video conference and now carried a leather portfolio under her arm. "Ms. Thompson, Agent Chen tells me you've successfully diagnosed and repaired the issue." "Yes, Madam President. The vehicle should function properly now under all driving conditions." "Outstanding." President Hammond gestured toward a side entrance. "Would you walk with me for a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss." Diane followed the president through a door that led to a small, secure conference room. Two Secret Service agents took positions outside as President Hammond closed the door, creating a private space that felt simultaneously intimate and surreal. "Please, sit," President Hammond said, settling into a chair and gesturing to the one across from her. "Can I get you anything? Water, coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you, Madam President." President Hammond studied Diane's face for a moment before speaking. "Ms. Thompson, I want you to understand something. What happened to you today wasn't an isolated incident or a simple misunderstanding. It was a manifestation of biases that persist in our society despite decades of progress." Diane nodded slowly. "Madam President, I appreciate your intervention today, but I've been dealing with versions of this my entire career. People see a black woman with tools and assume I'm lost, or cleaning, or someone's assistant. Today was just more dramatic than usual." "Exactly," President Hammond said, leaning forward. "And that's unacceptable. You shouldn't have to anticipate being treated as suspicious simply for existing in professional spaces. No one should." She opened her portfolio and pulled out a folder. "I've asked my team to compile information about you. I hope you don't mind, I wanted to understand who I was working with today." Diane felt a flutter of anxiety. "Of course, Madam President. Thompson Precision Solutions has a 98% customer satisfaction rating across 28 years in business. You've trained over 40 apprentices, 15 of whom now run their own successful automotive businesses. You've testified as an expert witness in 23 federal cases. You volunteer with programs that teach STEM skills to underprivileged youth. You're married to Patricia Thompson, a social worker, and together you've fostered 7 children over the past decade." President Hammond looked up from the folder. "You're not just an excellent mechanic, Ms. Thompson. You're a pillar of your community who's spent decades creating opportunities for others." Diane felt tears threatening. "I just try to do good work and help where I can." "That humility is admirable, but don't diminish what you've accomplished." President Hammond closed the folder. "Here's what I want to do. First, I'm personally calling the Alexandria police chief. Those officers will face consequences for their actions, not to destroy their careers, but to ensure they understand the gravity of what they did. Madam President, I don't want to ruin anyone's life over. You're not ruining anything. They made choices that had consequences. Accountability isn't punishment, it's education." President Hammond's voice was firm but kind. "Second, I'm directing the Department of Justice to review security protocols at all federal facilities. We need to ensure that authorized civilians, particularly women and people of color, aren't subjected to discriminatory treatment by law enforcement." Diane absorbed this, recognizing the broader implications. That could help a lot of people. Third, President Hammond continued, I'd like your permission to share your story. Not for political purposes, but because people need to understand that these incidents still happen, even in secure facilities, even when someone has been explicitly authorized to be there. I'm not looking for attention, Madam President. I understand. But silence allows these patterns to continue unchallenged. Your story, your professionalism under pressure, your expertise, your grace when faced with accusations, it matters. Diane considered this carefully. Patricia had always encouraged her to speak up about the discrimination she faced, but Diane had preferred to let her work speak for itself. Maybe it was time to use her voice differently. If you think it will help others, you have my permission. President Hammond smiled warmly. Thank you. Now, there's one more thing. She pulled out her phone and opened her contacts. I'd like your business information. The White House maintains relationships with trusted contractors. I suspect we'll need your expertise again. Diane provided her contact details, still processing the surreal nature of giving her business card to the President of the United States. As they stood to leave, President Hammond paused at the door. Ms. Thompson, when I was a young prosecutor, I had a case thrown out by a judge who told me I was too emotional for the courtroom. The male prosecutor who took over my case used the exact same arguments and won. That judge saw my gender before he saw my competence. She opened the door, and they walked back toward the parking area together. I've spent my entire career proving that assumptions about who belongs were usually wrong. You reminded me today why that fight still matters. Back at her vehicle, Diane loaded her toolbox while Agent Hall coordinated the test drive that would verify her repairs. Several Secret Service agents approached to thank her personally for her work. Agent Chen handed her an envelope. Ms. Thompson, this is your payment for today's service, along with a bonus approved by the President for the distress you experienced. Diane opened the envelope and her eyes widened. The check was for 3 times her normal rate, plus a substantial additional amount. This is too much. It's what you earned, Agent Chen said firmly. And frankly, it doesn't come close to compensating you for what those officers put you through. As Diane prepared to leave, President Hammond returned one final time. Without hesitation, she pulled Diane into a warm, genuine embrace that surprised both of them. Thank you for your service today, Ms. Thompson. Not just to me, but to everyone who'll benefit from the changes your experience will help create. Diane found her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for seeing me, Madam President. For really seeing me. Always, President Hammond said simply. 3 weeks later, Diane sat in her office at Thompson Precision Solutions, watching the national news coverage of President Hammond's executive order reforming security protocols at federal facilities. The segment included interview footage with Diane, explaining what had happened and how it felt to be treated as suspicious despite having proper authorization. The response had been overwhelming. Her business phone rang constantly with messages of support. Other women and people of color shared their own stories of being questioned in professional spaces where they belonged. The conversation had expanded beyond her personal experience to address broader patterns of bias in law enforcement and security. Officers Morrison and Peterson had been suspended for 2 weeks without pay and required to complete comprehensive training on implicit bias and proper credential verification procedures. They'd also written formal apologies to Diane, not publicized, but genuine expressions of understanding about how their assumptions had caused harm. The Alexandria Police Department implemented new protocols requiring officers to verify authorization through proper channels before detaining anyone in secure facilities. Similar changes were being adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country. But the change Diane treasured most came in the form of letters from young women and girls who'd seen her story. They wrote about wanting to become engineers, mechanics, and technicians. They thanked her for showing them that professional excellence could overcome bias, and that standing in your truth mattered even when it felt difficult. Patricia read one letter aloud over dinner. Dear Miss Thompson, I'm 14 years old and I love taking apart engines. My guidance counselor told me to think about more realistic careers for someone like me. After seeing your story, I told her I'm going to be an automotive engineer just like you. Thank you for not giving up. Diane wiped tears from her eyes. That's why the president was right about sharing the story. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When she opened it, she smiled. Miss Thompson, the Lincoln is running perfectly. No issues in over 200 miles of test driving. Thank you again for your expertise and your grace. President Hammond. Diane showed Patricia the message, and they both laughed at the surreal normalcy of receiving a text from the president. So, Patricia said, raising her wine glass, how does it feel being the mechanic who fixed the president's car and changed federal security policy in the same day? Diane clinked her glass against Patricia's. It feels like maybe the world is slowly learning that assumptions about who belongs where are usually wrong. And that expertise, dignity, and professionalism look different than people expect. She thought about that morning 3 weeks ago, kneeling beside a vehicle while police officers accused her of crimes, never imagining that the president sat just feet away, listening to everything. She thought about how easily that situation could have escalated if President Hammond hadn't been there to witness it. And she thought about all the times similar incidents happened to people who didn't have powerful witnesses, whose stories went untold, whose dignity was questioned without consequence. The real work, Diane said quietly, is making sure that what happened to me leads to lasting change for everyone else. So the next person in my position doesn't need the president to step out of a car to be treated with basic respect. Patricia squeezed her hand. And that work continues tomorrow. Yes, Diane agreed, looking at the stack of letters from young people inspired by her story. Yes, it does. Because dignity isn't something that should require powerful witnesses to be recognized. It's something every person deserves, in every space, regardless of who's watching. The video of President Hammond embracing Diane had been viewed over 80 million times. But more importantly, it had sparked conversations in homes, schools, police departments, and government offices about assumptions, bias, and the ongoing work of building a society where everyone belongs in spaces where their skills are needed. One diagnostic repair. One moment of injustice witnessed. One president willing to use her voice for accountability. Sometimes change happens in small moments that create massive ripples. What will your moment be?